Welcome to Herbally Yours, an adventure into the world of natural medicine. Here is your host, Dr. Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse who will help you take the leap to ultimate wellness.
Greetings, and thank you so much for joining me, Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse, for another edition of Herbally Yours, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Herbally Yours brings you the latest information about the many facets in the world of natural living. Today, my guest is Brigitte Shea, and she is a licensed acupuncturist, herbalist, author, and wellness director with over 20 years of experience in the holistic healing arts. Her private practice is an integration of energetic, Chinese, and Ayurvedic medicines. She enjoys teaching workshops on Eastern wisdom and energy healing and is the author of several books, including the Handbook of Chinese Medicine and Ayurveda, and her newest book that we'll be talking about today, Cultivating Your Microbiome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us, Brigitte, what did you start in a path of holistic living? What put you on that path?
I would say it was initially a trip to Greece in 1992, where we visited the temple of Asclepius in Epidaurus. And I learned there that people would go for healing to this temple, and they had these dream healing centers. And at these places, people that were not being cured with the medicine at the time would enter the temple, and they would be attended to by the priests and priestesses, and they would take ritual baths and do various preparatory things before they slept overnight in the temple. And some of the stelae that depicts what would happen in the temples actually shows women over these people as they sleep with their hands kind of hovering over them, similar to how one might experience a Reiki treatment today. And in these temples, people would have dreams where the god Asclepius or one of his assistants would come to them and give them a message as to why they were sick and what they could do to heal themselves, and if they couldn't heal, what they could do to live their life to the fullest regardless. And that fascinated me because I had always been a vivid dreamer. I had experience with having dreams that would actually reflect reality sometime later. And so I was just very astonished by something like that being in our history, since we ascribe Western civilization to ancient Greek civilization, having its roots there, and Western medicine is also recognized as having its roots in ancient Greek medicine. So I was fascinated by this and explored it more, and then I ended up doing some energy healing trainings after that, and just fell in love with the whole magic of it.
And all of that, we do see that thread through every tradition in healing, even going so far back as Saint Hildegard, somebody I really love to follow. And she was a nun, and we're talking about in the year 1000 something, long ago, but yet in the Western tradition, because she was actually the head of the German scientific community, and yet she was a nun and brought that concept of spiritual healing across the board, as we see in every tradition, such as Maimonides, who was a great Jewish rabbi who also brought that in. In fact, there's no tradition you can look at where spiritual is not considered, only Western medicine.
That's right.
And what we're talking about right now is kind of modern Western medicine. But yet you took it further because you also are highly trained being a licensed acupuncturist.
That's right. I mean, when I was doing the energy healing work, I was integrating many different modalities and following my intuitive guidance when working with people. And I was noticing that they were having really profound things happen to them during the course of the sessions. And I was starting to see some patterns with how certain things felt and what the person was presenting with. So I wanted to learn more about how that worked on a more physical or tangible level. And that's what drew me to do Chinese medicine and to go to acupuncture school.
And that's a big step, because I think that is such an excellent training, because you're a licensed professional and you get really great scientific data also about things like anatomy and physiology. And very often when people just are working in energy, they're not understanding that portion as well.
That's right. And it gives you, I feel, a more of a foundation with any kind of medicine or any skill. We have to learn the very basic foundations of what the art that follows that skill is built upon. And by having that grounding in some sort of a system, it doesn't mean that you have to only do that one thing all the time. But what it does is it gives you a framework with which to understand everything by, and it helps to ground what you're doing into it just helps you to feel more grounded and to ground what you're doing and to help the person be more grounded that you're working with. And it helps you to understand what they're coming to you with, right? So a lot of times people will come to energy medicine or acupuncture because they've already been the Western medicine route, and they may have a chronic ailment that there really is no Western treatment for. So when they seek you out, they oftentimes have all kinds of lab work and scans, and knowing what all that stuff means really helps you to connect with the client and to understand at a basic level what it is that they have going on in their bodies.
Yes, I definitely agree. And I'd like to remind you, listeners, you're listening to Herbally Yours on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse. And today, our guest is Bridget Shea. And we're going to be talking about her book, Cultivating Your Microbiome, Ayurvedic and Chinese Practices for a Healthy Gut and a Clear Mind. So, Bridget, why did you choose to use microbiome as the call out and topic of this book?
When I started reading about the microbiome a few years ago, I was immediately fascinated by it and drawn to learn more. And I think rationally that part of the reason for that is because it, to me, seems to be a bridge between what sounds like esoteric teachings in Chinese medicine or mystical things that don't exist in three-dimensional reality and Western medicine. The microbiome is responsible for so many processes that happen in the body and for actually how we feel, what we think, and then the emotions that are tied to those thoughts. And so by understanding the microbiome, it actually helped me better understand the different types of qi or vitality that are categorized in Chinese medicine, for example. In Chinese medicine school, the teachers would say, this stuff is not some airy thing that's way out in the ether somewhere. Qi is a tangible substance as well as being intangible. So the fact that we have this science on the microbiome now, it really helps to inform us as practitioners and as just the layperson wanting to learn more about how to take better care of themselves as to what's really happening beneath the scenes.
That's excellent. So, let's define, not everybody may know, what is the microbiome?
So the microbiome is actually about 50% of what makes up your physical body. So you're actually only half human. And that is a massive concept to wrap one's head around. We're 50% human cells and about 50% microbes. A microbe is a very, very tiny organism. It can be a virus, it can be a bacteria, it can be a fungus. there are many, many trillions of these little entities that make up the microbiome. So the collective of all of these organisms that are not human cells, that are in and on the body, are what make up our microbiome.
What's very interesting to me is, because we work with microbiome all the time, is that as the actual organisms that are part of kind of that city state that lives inside everyone, which microorganisms are there matter because they release specific chemical compounds that influence our health. One that I love to talk about that people sometimes recognize is Candida albicans. People go, I have Candida. Well, what that microorganism does is it releases chemical messengers that fit into receptor sites in your brain, which is in the area that makes you crave sugar. So you turn into a robot walking around looking for sugar and putting it in your mouth because you're being told to do that by the chemical messages in your brain being released by that candida, because that's what they need for their own subsistence. So we become one city state with our microbes. It's amazing.
It is. It's fascinating. It's like they're the puppeteer in many instances that are pulling the strings on our behavior.
So stepping back and learning that, I think, is so powerful, because yes, you might have to take some steps like stop eating sugar altogether for a period of time. And, then it's a war, but at least you know what it's about. And usually after about 3 days, people get that feeling under control.
That's true. Yeah, it can be hard at first because those little microbes, they're trying to survive. Just like our bodies are trying to survive in the world, their bodies are trying to survive in the world of our body. We're the host. And so they're trying to tell us what they need so that they can thrive. And that's great if it's beneficial communities that we want to enhance. But when more pathogenic communities are dominant, or when the balance is off between the different communities of microbes in the gut, then we may crave things that aren't for our highest good. They're for the good of that particular colony.
Now, how can we influence which microorganisms are actually living with us in our holy temple?
Well, one way is by consuming more fermented food products, and not huge amounts, but like condiment-sized amounts with each meal. And those can include anything from kefir to a fresh organic yogurt without sugar in it or fruit, to sauerkrauts and kimchis, and there are many, many different fermented foods that we can consume that contain the beneficial microbes that we want growing in the gut. And there are other things that we can do with our diet as well, like leaning toward seasonal, whole, organic, fresh fruits and vegetables, and leaning away from processed and packaged foods.
Well, that is very good advice. Now, in terms of sauerkraut, one thing I have noticed is, because the whole conversation of the microbiome, as you said, has been going on really only for a few years. They've been using that particular word, like maybe the last 10 only. When we look at sauerkrauts, one thing I have been noticing is that even in conventional grocery stores now, there is this growth of availability in different, much better brands of sauerkraut, because the older ones, I'm not going to name a brand, but the one people always put on hot dogs at the game, those you can buy them in the store, but if you read the label, it has benzoates and sorbates and other toxic chemical preservatives. But the newer version really has just vegetables when you read the back panel. And they taste slightly sour. That's part of sauerkraut. That's why it's called sauerkraut. But really is so delicious. And like you shared, Bridget, you only need a tablespoon or maybe even a teaspoon or two a day. You don't sit there and eat the whole thing.
Right. And the same thing with kombucha. You don't want to drink like the whole bottle of kombucha in one sitting. That's an awful lot. So smaller doses is what's best.
I have to say, I'm not a big fan of kombucha because it really is high in sugar. Mm-hmm. And like you said, they're selling it now, even in mainstream grocery stores. Shelves and shelves are full of it. So it really took off. And people do feel energized when they first use it, but that is because it is loaded with sugar. I'm really not a fan of it, but sipping a little, would be appropriate.
Right. It's good to have some sweet in one's diet, but anything in excess is not recommended. The other thing I wanted to say with sauerkrauts and pickles and things like that is you want to check the label, of course, for any preservatives that may be present, but also to find out if they're actually products that have probiotics in them, because sometimes, especially with like pickles, they'll be in vinegar, and you want to find something that's salt brined. That is what is going to encourage the growth of the beneficial microbes.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, most sauerkrauts do have vinegar when you read the back of the label.
Mm-hmm. So you want to try and find something that's mostly salt-based.
And, of course, it's easy to make on your own. They sell those sauerkraut makers, and they're just like a porcelain container with a weight. Mm-hmm. And those are really interesting because they're really just self-fermenting, but they do use salt, like you said.
Right. Yep.
So those are really, really good tips for people to use. Now, what about the big push on something called probiotics, where you just take pills of probiotics? What is your teaching on that?
I feel that they have their place, of course, but I don't think that just thinking one can take some probiotics and that's going to balance their microbiome is a really good way to think about them, because what happens with probiotics is when you take it, the capsule will open up inside your body and those beneficial microbes will spill out. But there's no research that shows that it actually will colonize inside the gut. So it pretty much just goes right through your body. And in instances where people may have like chronic gas and bloating, they may have something called SIBO, or small intestine bacterial overgrowth. And taking probiotics or taking certain strains of probiotics when one is experiencing this condition can actually aggravate it. And there are other conditions that can happen with too. So I feel that the best thing to do is to start with one's lifestyle and one's diet, because what you eat is actually the food for the probiotics you already have inside of you. And that's what is best to cultivate.
So that's the probiotics, which people recognize as, things you can buy even in the drugstore nowadays. When I started, it was only in the health food store. Mm-hmm. And now there's a newer word, which you can help us understand, called prebiotics. Mm-hmm. What are prebiotics?
So prebiotics are basically fibers that the microbes in your gut eat. So prebiotics are either capsules or powders that can be mixed into water or juice that people consume in order to feed the beneficial microbes in their gut.
But of course, they're also available just as a food. For instance, an excellent prebiotic is something called inulin. So in the grocery stores at certain times of year, they have Jerusalem artichokes, which are also called sunchokes commercially. Mm-hmm. And those are just naturally high and are an excellent thing to include in your diet as a prebiotic.
That's right. And that's why it's beneficial to eat whole seasonal foods. If we are eating a more balanced whole diet, we don't need to take a lot of supplements. And also at the change of seasons, the microbes in our guts shift. So they change because, historically throughout the centuries, they've evolved to know that at certain times of the year, there will be certain foods present. So the microbes that digest those foods that are more abundant at that time of year increase in the gut. And we actually need those foods in order to be able to feed them.
That's really interesting about the seasonality of the natural cycle of the microbes among us that actually live in our body. But of course, I'm sure their cycle has been thrown off just like the entire planet, because even in a day, our day is no longer really based on the sun and light availability. It's all been moved around artificially.
That's right. And the microbes are still on that sun cycle, and we are on all kinds of cycles. So there's a disharmony right there between the microbiome and what we do with our lifestyle that can impact the microbiome adversely.
And one thing I'm sure that as a health provider and as a licensed massage therapist and a licensed acupuncturist, and the fact that you're actually working with people, I'm sure you see a huge change in every aspect of their life if they were to follow some of these changes, like just eating more whole foods. If you come in my kitchen, this what's there. There's nothing in a package, nothing with a paragraph on it. Just pieces of food. And that's how you can tell if you're eating whole food. You don't have to go to that grocery store with that name. You can just find, is this a whole food or is this in a box or prepackaged?
Absolutely.
And then, of course, it involves a little bit of cooking. I cook very simply. The only cooking method I actually use is just steaming. Mm-hmm. And I steam a whole lot of different vegetables every few days. And then I'll just eat them cold or warm them up slightly, when I have a chance. So it doesn't have to be a big involved process, although it can be if you enjoy cooking. Now, you have a lot in your book about something called the Bristol stool chart. And I think that's a really wonderful, fascinating part of your book, Cultivating Your Microbiome. What is the Bristol stool chart?
The Bristol stool chart is the chart that is widely used by gastroenterologists to determine the state of one's stool. So it categorizes stool formation from the most constipated type of poop to the loosest, and to diarrhea. And so you can see, like if you look at your bowel movements, you can see where you fall in the categories in the Bristol stool chart. And in the book, I explain what those all mean according to Western and Eastern medicine, and how to bring yourself into more of a balanced place regarding your digestion.
And that's such a wonderful self-care measure that people can take. I'm sure a lot of people don't. It just goes away and they're never even checking out what's going on with my digestive system through just looking at their stool. And people who go to the bathroom once every 3 days or so and are told by their conventional physician that that's normal, what would you say to that?
I would say that that's a form of constipation, that there's some stagnation present. There's either a motility issue or something else going on. And I would try and help regulate that person's gut so that they were able to go on a more regular basis.
And when you say you would try, really the person has to do it. You can act as an educator.
Absolutely. But if they're coming to me for help with that, then I would definitely do what I could to give them the information that I know works, that they could implement into their lifestyle in order to get things flowing a bit better.
And in addition, as an acupuncturist, I'm sure you can do a therapy that also helps through the energetic meridians to rebalance the gut.
Yes, I do that as well.
Now, what are the primary tastes? Because in Western food, we don't have those primary tastes, but in most of the world, in ethnic food cultures, they do.
Yes, they have 6 tastes, and we're familiar with 5 of those in Western culture: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and pungent. And the additional tastes in Ayurveda are astringent, and in Chinese teachings is bland. And so what is recommended is that at every meal, we're incorporating all of the tastes into our diet. And this can be a little tricky for people at first, because first we need to learn what those tastes are and what foods fall into each of those categories. And from there, we can maybe start incorporating those 5 tastes into our whole day, or 6 tastes. And then from there, start incorporating them into every meal. And it's believed in Eastern medicine that by incorporating all of the tastes, what you're doing is you're actually giving your gut a balanced blend of nutrition and feeding all the microbes that we want to cultivate in order to stay healthy.
And how would you do that?
Simply by looking at, you can look at the food chart right in the book. It explains what sweet tastes are. So very generally speaking, sweet is part of almost everything that we eat, but we categorize meat and grains as sweet. Salty tastes are, of course, salt, and there are certain kinds of salt, and in Eastern medicine, we actually encourage the usage of certain kinds of salt because they're necessary for the proper balance in the body. And so salty things can be salt. They can be rock salt or black salt, Himalayan salt, or they can be miso, for example, which is an Eastern-based product that can be used in soups and even on crackers. And then the sour taste, of course, we're familiar with lemon and lime, but then we also have the sauerkrauts. Bitter is a lot of leafy, dark greens. And pungent, we know, is onions and garlic and chilies. So it's not that hard to do once you know what all the tastes are. It's just a matter of actually incorporating each of them into every meal.
Well, that's a good outline of steps that people actually can take. And your book is a beautiful guidance about how to do a dietary reset protocol, how to cultivate your microbiome, which of course is what you're speaking about today. So we're just about out of time, Bridget. Can you tell people how they can find your book and how they can find you and more information about cultivating your microbiome?
Yes, my book is available pretty much at any bookseller. I always like to encourage that people explore their local small bookstore. But if that's not an option for you right now, then Inner Traditions, my publisher, has it. You can find it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. And my website is bridgetshea.com. That's Bridget like bridge, TTE. Shea, SHEA.com. And there are lots of resources on my site. This interview will be on the site at some point once it's available. And there are links to different events that I'm offering, etc.
Well, thank you so much for being our guest today. And thank you, listeners, for joining us once again for another edition of Herbally Yours, produced in the studios of 90.3 WHPC. You can also, of course, listen to the show there or also on iHeartRadio. And we're at Nassau Community College, Garden City, New York. For further information, we'd love to have you email us at whpc@ncc.edu. This is your host, Ellen Kamai at naturalnurse.com, inviting you to join us again next week for another edition of Herbally Yours. Until then, stay healthy.